Today, China's catering industry is facing a price war, which is essentially a soul-searching question for everyone. Will you lower your prices or not?
In a sense, the stock market is an integrated market. The ability to acquire and integrate through profitability and cash flow leverage is actually a very important capability for continuous growth among existing players.
The price war might just be a phenomenon. The key is whether you have the ability to cope with it, including whether you can serve the customers gained from the price war well, and whether your entire supply chain and store operations can keep up.
Short-term benefits are always very tempting, especially when growth is at a bottleneck.
A brand is not just about storytelling or choices. Welcome to the brand consumption perspective of Phantom Visit. Hello everyone, welcome back. In 2024, the survival and challenges of the food and beverage industry are hot topics of daily discussion. I have been looking for more positive and constructive solutions to discuss with everyone. The feedback on the previous episode about Caesarea was very good, so today we will continue to talk about the stories of other Japanese food and beverage companies. The entire price war is one of the main themes in the domestic food and beverage industry in 2024. For example, we see Starbucks using various promotions to reduce the price of a single cup to below 20 yuan. McDonald's, KFC, and Burger King have also launched limited-time burger coupons for events like the 8.8 Golden Powder Festival and introduced flexible meal deals like the 12.9 1+1, bringing burgers into the 9.9 yuan era. What about the Chinese food sector? Mian, which focuses on fast food categories, has already reduced the price of its mainstream products to between 16 and 29 yuan, with some products seeing a price drop of over 30%. Throughout the second half of the year, industry associations have been called in to urge a stop to the price wars. Not to mention, people have probably been enjoying 9.9 yuan coffee and even 8.8 or 7.7 yuan coffee for quite some time now. In this era of stock consumption, can price reductions truly lead to success? Or is it just a temporary fix like drinking poison to quench thirst? What fundamental skills are needed for a restaurant brand to endure through cycles? Today, our guest is still from HeyGen Capital, Japan research expert Dongzi. Let's welcome Dongzi to say hello to everyone.
Hello everyone, I am Dongzi, the research director at HeyGen Capital. HeyGen Capital is an investment institution that focuses specifically on the consumer sector, and I am responsible for research work there.
In the previous two episodes, we also talked with Changming about topics related to the supply chain, including your investments. Why don't you first briefly introduce what you are mainly responsible for over there, because I have seen many of your research reports and they are quite interesting.
I am mainly responsible for research here. Since my background is that my mother is Chinese, I have always used a comparative perspective between China and Japan to help the fund make decisions. What has happened in Japan? What can be referenced? And what cannot be referenced? Through such comparisons, some industry variables are also depicted more clearly. Based on these variables, we make some investment decisions, and later, we use the knowledge gained from this research to assist our invested companies. So, the decision-making before investment and the support and research after investment are my main responsibilities.
Understood. Then you must be very familiar with the entire retail and dining sectors in Japan. I have also seen many in-depth reports, and following the topic we're discussing today, the Japanese dining sector is actually an area that has received relatively little attention before. Well, the first thing I'm curious about is, regarding Japan's domestic dining, is the proportion of chain restaurants high? Which are the leading dining companies? What has been the brief development process over the past 20 to 30 years?
Japan as a whole is actually a country with a lot of small and medium-sized dining establishments. To elaborate, this is related to the commercialization of real estate, as the land is privately owned. This allows many individuals to open small restaurants on properties owned by private landlords, making it a very fragmented market. However, despite being such a fragmented market, it is still moving towards a more centralized direction. This information was actually learned during my first year of college. At that time, the top 100 dining enterprises in Japan accounted for about 10.5% of the market, which is very low. By 2022, the top 10 accounted for about 13%, so there has been a significant increase, but it is still relatively slow. Compared to other more market-driven economies or markets, Japan is still relatively fragmented.
I understand. This might be similar to our personal experience if we visit often. We all feel that Japan has a lot of delicious food, but most of them are single stores, not even chains, just small shops. There are many gourmet options, but very few seats, and they are all boutique stores. But actually, isn't it true that the top 10 chain restaurants in Japan might not be that well known to Chinese consumers? Besides Caesarea, which we mentioned earlier, there are some quite famous ones that actually have thousands or even tens of thousands of outlets in Japan. What are the main categories of these chains? Could you give everyone a brief introduction?
Actually, among the top 10 in Japan, there are some that people have heard of. For example, the number one is called Zensho, which is actually the parent company of Sukiya. Really, the second one, for instance, includes McDonald's, which is a foreign company, and there's also Sushiro, which has recently opened a store in southern China and just opened one in Beijing. Ah, I really didn't know that. There's also the parent company of Gyukaku, which does barbecue, and another one that makes udon noodles called Toridol, which has a chain known as Marugame Seimen. Of course, we have the well-known Yoshinoya. Brands like these are quite famous in Japan, but each brand, or rather each group, might actually have 10 to 20 brands under its umbrella. This means that there are many brands, and even Japanese people might not know which group a particular brand belongs to.
So they all operate with multiple brands.
Yes, a company might have one or two core brands, and the rest are more niche, long-tail brands.
I feel that in China, the more famous ones are Yoshinoya. I know there's one called Coco Ichibanya Curry House, and then there's Seizeria. These three might be relatively well known in China, and they have some stores there. The others are mostly based in Japan, right? Yes. Hey, let's talk about what I think has been the biggest trend over the past 30 years. It should be the gyudon, beef bowl category, which has been the fastest growing vertical. This is also closely related to the competitive landscape between Yoshinoya and Ishizakiya. Why don't we start by telling everyone the story behind this?
Actually, the beef bowl category in Japan is a quick lunch solution for blue-collar or white-collar workers. It's a highly standardized and fast restaurant option. When the founder of Yoshinoya first started the business, I remember he mentioned that the goal was to make it both fast and delicious, starting with these characteristics. However, this category, despite having strong demand in Japan over the years, has gone through significant price wars. So, although there might be some growth, this growth doesn't come from purely organic means, but rather from new demand stimulated by its low prices. That's one way to understand it.
Why did people start eating beef bowls in the first place? Because in Japan, most of the traditional foods were initially sushi and ramen, right? Since many people have probably tried Yoshinoya's beef bowl, which has beef on top and rice underneath, how did this combination and category become popular in Japan?
That's a very interesting question. Firstly, in ancient times, Japanese people did not eat beef. It was a country with very little animal protein. It wasn't until the Meiji Restoration, when there was a need to satisfy the demands of foreigners, that beef started to appear in places like Kobe and Yokohama. This was the very early origin of Kobe beef. To satisfy foreigners, they invented something called sukiyaki, which is soy sauce with sugar and beef. The simplified version of sukiyaki can be understood as beef bowl. At that time, the first Yoshinoya store was located in the Nihonbashi fish market in Tokyo, which is a large wholesale seafood market. It was a single-item lunch option for the workers at the seafood market, so it aimed to provide a certain amount of fat and nutrition, while also being quick and timely. It evolved from there into a single-item dish. So indeed, from a historical perspective, it's not that traditionally Japanese, but it is a product of modernization.
The famous one later on is called Ishizakiya, and their parent company Zensho is probably the largest publicly traded restaurant chain in Japan, right? Did their founder originally come from Yoshinoya?
Yes, the owner felt that Yoshinoya was not doing well, so he decided to start his own business. That's roughly the history, because Yoshinoya has indeed made many poor decisions in the past. For example, Yoshinoya went bankrupt once in Japan in the late 1970s. At that time, the beef supply chain in Japan was insufficient, meaning there wasn't enough beef supply. However, Yoshinoya was eager to expand its stores, so during that period they used freeze-drying technology for their meat and broth. This significantly compromised the taste. Although freeze-drying is better for transportation, the compromised taste led to a loss of customers, pushing them into a bankruptcy crisis. Similar to this, from a business perspective, many mistakes were made that ideally shouldn't have been. This might also be one of the initial reasons why the founder of Ishizaki decided to leave a place like Yoshinoya to start his own business.
Perhaps this situation coincided with the economic stagnation in Japan starting from the 1990s, where the economy stopped growing, consumption downgraded, and people began to pursue higher cost effectiveness or even quality to price ratios, along with more rational and low desire consumption in such a large environment. So categories like this might be quite suitable for working people.
The consumption of egg swallows at noon has increased, so they have grown. This is actually a very mixed response. Strong running, singing Chinese songs from a price perspective. During the noon shift, a company's strategy can gain more work-related trust when the new market is not captured by conglomerates, but is gained by actual businesses. This still depends on the company's strategy or its ability to create new markets. There is a significant difference between actual businesses and conglomerates. Let me first say that conglomerates are a very male-dominated channel. This is the influence of Japanese people on conglomerates because it started as a blue-collar wholesale market where men would go to eat. Therefore, many women and generally older people do not go to conglomerates or find it difficult to enter these stores. What actual businesses do is more about time. My prices are still cheap, but my meals are. As a result, consumption, so they have grown. Yoshinoya attracts blue-collar workers. and so on. In fact, it uses the solution brought by low prices, combined with a diverse selection and a better space, to cover a broader consumer base. Essentially, the early growth of Sukiya captured a new market that a brand like Yoshinoya, despite having a market presence, had not been able to reach.
This might be a typical result of differentiated positioning in a niche market. But wasn't there a major crisis around 2003 or 2004 when beef imports were halted?
Yes, Japan has always been highly dependent on the US supply chain for beef, but the outbreak of mad cow disease in the US significantly affected Japan's dining industry. Of course, the category most affected was beef bowls.
Yes, I remember the mad cow disease in 2003 had quite a severe impact and many cattle were culled, right? This had a huge impact on their entire supply chain, didn't it? How did the two companies respond at that time? Did this lead to a divergence in competition?
Actually, the decisions made by the two companies were completely different at that time, and it was during this period that the revenue of the other company surpassed Yoshinoya's. It's about a new company quickly surpassing in a short period after its establishment. But behind this, although it's said to be different, it's hard to say whether it's right or wrong. The strategy Yoshinoya adopted was because it had made mistakes before. As I just mentioned, it went bankrupt due to changing ingredients, so it was actually very fearful of changing its supply chain. Oh, it said, I'd rather stop selling beef bowls and switch to selling chicken bowls. This is Yoshinoya's approach.
It took its main product off the shelves?
Yes, but this is also a way to protect its brand assets. But in contrast, Shakeup started testing ingredients from different origins at a very early stage and quickly switched to using Australian beef, using Australian fatty beef as the topping for their beef bowls.
Is there a taste difference between Australian beef and American beef?
Because American beef is grass-fed, and I understand that Australian beef is mostly grass-fed as well.
Ah, I see. So there might be a taste difference, right?
Yes, that's right. And in the distribution environment at that time, American beef was sold by specific cuts, meaning that for certain parts, there were middlemen wholesalers who would handle the division. But in Australia, selling whole cattle is more common. Actually, for many beef bowl companies, the parts they use are limited, but their procurement might have to be done by whole cattle, so it really tests the company's supply chain capabilities. So how does Shakeup solve this problem? Shakeup has a few key points. The first point is that it offers a variety of toppings. I don't know if any of you have been to a Shakeup store in China, but besides the regular beef bowl, it offers many options like cheese flavor, preserved meat, or a variety of other choices. The first thing is that its seasoning helps to slightly smooth out the differences in ingredients, giving it a deep red coffee bean feel, you know?
Because grass-fed beef might have a stronger gamey taste, right?
Yes, that's correct. The second point, which actually supports the future sustainable development of the entire Shakeup company, is a core capability called mass merchandise. The entire supply chain capability is based on the concept of utilizing a cow to its fullest, extending the theme of how to use every part of a cow completely. Previously, I interviewed their former general manager in China, and they told me that they recently finally used up the remaining few percent of beef scraps. I asked, how did you use it all up? He said that these meat scraps would typically appear during processing in the factory and would usually be discarded. However, they actually established a new brand for beef patties and used these materials in new business formats. The entire merger or development of new business formats often extends not only from a competitive dimension, but also from the advantages of its supply chain.
Oh, I find this very interesting. It reminds me of a story I heard before. When I was chatting with Lao Sun from Renyang, he mentioned that there's a big difference between selling beef and selling pork or chicken. Consumers can buy chicken or pork in portions, like a whole chicken or half a chicken, right? Although no one buys a whole pig anymore, some people still buy half a pig, and there are fewer parts, so the sales channels are relatively simple. They are professional cattle breeders, so why is cattle breeding a slow turnover business? There are many reasons, such as the long gestation period of calves, which leads to a low asset turnover rate, right? But there's another very important reason, which is what you mentioned, that consumers don't buy a whole cow or half a cow, they buy by parts. However, the popularity of different parts varies completely, or their level of demand is completely different, which inevitably leads to some parts being more popular and others less so. That's why we see significant price differences for beef, depending on the part, but this also means that the overall turnover rate for selling out is quite different. Therefore, selling beef requires multi-layer distribution to sell all the parts completely. As a result, the cash flow and the cattle raising process, as well as the profit margins from selling beef, are all decreasing. This has led to cattle being the last among all animal categories to be industrialized, and even today it hasn't been fully industrialized, with a lot of free-range practices still involved. I think this is quite an interesting matter, and perhaps Shakeup has managed to thoroughly address this aspect.
Yes, just to add a point. Actually, the first acquisition case of Shakeup was acquiring a Japanese category, called family dining, which is somewhat like a Western-style family gathering restaurant named Kokos, Kokos. A significant reason for acquiring this restaurant was also to increase the utilization rate of beef, because in Kokos, one of the famous categories is the beef burger patty, which is part of a meal set. So it was also from this perspective, so from zero side. From this angle, or from the perspective of cattle raising, as you said, the profit margin and turnover of each part are indeed different. But from the perspective of cuisine, from the perspective of retail, he might adjust these parts through commercial processing. For example, when making sausages, he might use meat scraps, so the whole. This very famous hard-to-sell parts are used up through this mixing method, but in this case, even the hard-to-sell parts are used up. Beef patties are vital in retail and farming. Facing margin issues, catering can improve. So, the replicability of this matter still needs to be explored. For example, there is a very famous supermarket in Japan called Lopia. This company is known as a category killer store for meat. Its core capability is selling a pig at a higher price through processing methods. Their meat is sold both cheaply and with high gross margins because they have developed many processed product categories. But at that time, we discussed whether this could be done in China, because our fund invests in something exactly like Aunt Qian. She said, oh no, and we went to take a look and found that Japanese people don't eat the front legs of pigs or pig trotters. There are many pig offal parts in Japan that are also rarely consumed. Ribs are the least valuable part in Japan, and they are all wholesaled to ramen shops for making soup. So the concept of using every part thoroughly might have already been realized in our Chinese cuisine.
For us, it's already been thoroughly utilized, but for them, it's still low-hanging fruit that can be picked, right?
It needs to be commercialized. Conversely, in China, finding better ways to utilize resources is still a topic worth exploring, although the impact or benefits might not be as significant as in Japan.
So going back, when did Ishizaki surpass Yoshinoya? Do they still maintain the top position in the food industry today?
Yes, in fact, it actually significantly surpassed Yoshinoya during the period of approximately 3 to 5 years when the import of beef was temporarily prohibited. Currently, Ishizaki has a revenue of about 40 billion RMB, while Yoshinoya's revenue is around 9 to 10 billion RMB.
A ratio of 1 to 4.
Yes, that's right.
I guess Ishizaki has about 10,000 stores in Japan, is that correct? Approximately.
It's roughly 10,000 stores, and they are all directly operated, a very notable point.
Wow, all directly operated stores. That's impressive because having a chain of 10,000 stores in the food industry is rare, even in China. China's population is about 10 times that of Japan, and the country is much larger, yet there aren't many like that. In China, the recent chains with 10,000 stores are mostly in the milk tea business, which is somewhat in the pre-prepared category, right?
Yes, indeed.
It's really impressive that they can operate 10,000 directly managed stores. So, looking back, do you think Yoshinoya really failed because of their supply chain capabilities? Or was it that they couldn't withstand the price wars?
I think this is a very mixed answer. Firstly, from the perspective of its survival, I don't think it failed because it survived. Even though its main products were taken off the shelves, it only suffered losses for a few years but managed to climb back up. From this perspective, it actually made the right choice. However, from the perspective of market-scale competition, it actually made the wrong choice. The reason is that it gave its competitors more space, or perhaps its own strategy didn't undergo much adjustment. It might have focused all its energy on survival, rather than on how to capture others' market share, missing a great opportunity.
So it's like in a crisis situation, the two companies took different directions and someone made the right bet, right?
Right.
Actually, if we look at it abstractly, today the Chinese catering industry, when facing a price war, is essentially facing a soul-searching question. Should you lower your prices or not? If you lower prices, you might fail. If you don't lower prices, you might also fail. So what should you do?
From the perspective of Japan, it's really about where the value point you provide to consumers is, and this is always a very important issue. From my side, I might elaborate on this point. In Japan, the ability to lower prices is due to changes in the upstream supply chain. Besides external factors like deflation, the introduction of many industrialized food processes and technologies has reduced overall costs. However, when everyone lowers prices, another phenomenon occurs. Everyone's taste becomes similar. It's like how users in our country now might say, oh, is this place serving the same dishes again? They all taste similar. Is Meikai Kolo serving the same dishes? A similar situation occurred in Japan. Previously, when I communicated with some leading Japanese seasoning companies, they mentioned that in the 1990s, serving the Japanese restaurant industry felt very boring because everyone was just watching their competitors' prices and matching whatever their competitors offered. Moreover, they might all be using the same supplier, continuously lowering prices. In such an environment, the more important question to ask is, how can we differentiate ourselves? On the basis of a certain price level, how is differentiation achieved?
I think this might lead to a more important and critical issue, which is that price wars are just a phenomenon possibly a response to the behavior of everyone in the market environment. The more crucial question is how you differentiate yourself in the minds of users and where your core competitiveness lies. Looking at these two cases, it may not necessarily be that one is definitely successful or the other is definitely a failure. It's just that, for example, in the case of Ishizaki, its core capabilities, particularly in the supply chain, may perform better in response to such a market environment. But if you don't have such supply chain capabilities today and you insist on competing on price, it may not necessarily lead to success. You should probably think more about how to differentiate yourself in that environment. I believe this is still an eternal proposition. Even though Ishizaki is considered a fast food chain, and indeed it is with relatively low prices, in its early days, many in Japan thought it was better than an entrepreneur.
Okay. The reason why it's a delicious category, is that all the meat is made from fresh meat, not frozen meat. They transport Australian premium beef or specific cuts to Japan's central factory in vacuum packaging for processing. The meat is delivered to the stores in a fresh state, meaning that every morning the stores stew this beef. Oh, so even though it's a very fast chain-style fast food category, there is actually a certain level of differentiation behind it, something that not everyone can do.
I understand, and talking about this makes me curious about another case, which is McDonald's. Actually, the first time I saw the ranking of Japanese restaurant chains, I was a bit surprised because in a broad sense, McDonald's is considered junk food, right? It's fast food, isn't it? But of course, McDonald's is quite tasty too. But it really depends on where you are. For example, if you're a tourist visiting Japan, you probably wouldn't eat at McDonald's because there are so many delicious things in Japan, right? So why is McDonald's still so successful in Japan? I think, first of all, I should correct myself. I actually think McDonald's in Japan is quite tasty.
Okay. Actually, when traveling, I highly recommend trying McDonald's because it's better than the one back home. A weak supply chain risks price wars. Stand out instead. Fresh meat, vacuum packed in Australia, shipped. The conditions for keeping warm or storing might be better.
Okay, I'll try it next time. So how do they do it in Japan?
I think going back to your earlier question about why McDonald's does well, I believe a very important reason is because it's cheap. Its pricing strategy in Japan has always captured the largest demographic, and it has attracted a group of young consumers with its emotional value. This is something it has done very deeply. Because in Japan, in other words, eating KFC is considered a very luxurious category.
Oh, so KFC and McDonald's are not positioned the same way in Japan.
They're not positioned the same. KFC is twice as expensive as McDonald's.
Right, that's interesting. When KFC and McDonald's entered China, of course, it was related to the consumption level at the time. Actually, it was similar to Pizza Hut back then. Although it's fast food, it wasn't cheap, it was expensive fast food. And over the past 30 years, I think McDonald's and KFC in today's China can't be considered cheap fast food. They might be mid-range. It's like they've maintained their price range, and as people's income and consumption levels have increased, they've gradually shifted from being expensive to mid-range, but they haven't reached a low-end status yet. But in Japan, did McDonald's and KFC choose a different strategy from the start?
Completely different. Initially, around the 1970s, it might have been considered a high-end product. However, by the time there were many McDonald's outlets, it actually developed in the direction of low prices. As for KFC, it has always maintained a relatively high-end image. Japanese people might think of eating KFC during Christmas, which is a category that places great importance on the occasion. This actually also depends on McDonald's localization strategy in Japan under a deflationary environment, which is a very important point. Back in 2002, especially starting from the late 1990s, deflation was actually very severe, right? In 1997, 1998, and 1999, during the years of the Asian financial crisis, over 2 years, it dropped by about 4 to 5% in total, right? In this situation, many people's income and their sensitivity to prices would change. So McDonald's launched a big campaign saying that several of their core burgers were half price. So at that time, there were a few burgers, like their standard meat burger, which is just a slice of meat between the buns, was originally 100 yen, and it was cut down to 65 yen.
So cheap.
Based on the current exchange rate, it might be around 3 yuan, and according to the exchange rate at that time, it might have been 5 yuan, which is very cheap. Then the cheeseburger, which was originally 160 yen, was cut down to 80 yen, also half price.
So this is actually the same story as the beef bowl we just talked about, and both are different ways of eating beef. But are their users also the kind of groups you mentioned, like blue-collar workers and families?
In the early years, McDonald's in Japan was actually more family-oriented because they had kids' meals. It was a place where white-collar mothers or full-time housewives would take their children, and there might also be a demand from students going there after school.
So this probably contributed to its rapid growth from year to year. And I later noticed that the entire burger market in Japan became segmented. Apart from them, others entering the market started making high-end burgers like Shake Shack, and there was also an established burger chain, Moss Burger, right? They are all more high-end, right? So they occupied the low-end market.
Because it cannot compete in pre-made products, it can only focus on freshly made items. So both Moss Burger and foreign brands like Shake Shack, as well as local ones, are moving towards freshly made high-value products.
At that time, McDonald's was targeting the entire mid to low price range of users. Well, this actually seems like a very smooth and correct development positioning. Its brand itself is very strong, and indeed, Japan has a certain admiration for American culture, right? And their supply chain is definitely not a problem, with the advantages of a global supply chain, right? China's and Japan's supply chains might be similar, but why haven't we seen them in the top 1 or 2 positions in recent years?
Did something happen later on? Actually, in recent years, their performance has been relatively good, and they have made many adjustments in between. However, from around 2008 to 2015, McDonald's revenue in Japan was halved. Around 2008, I remember their revenue was about 400 billion yen, and by around 2011, it had dropped to approximately 158 billion yen. So there was a significant change, and the price cuts were a bit too drastic. This was their biggest strategic move, which attracted many less desirable customers. At that time, McDonald's in Japan operated 24 hours and was cheap, so at night the crowd was very mixed. Some people might not even make a purchase or just buy the cheapest burger and stay there all night. This led to an increase in customer traffic, but the store operations couldn't keep up with this influx. The overall customer experience also declined. Many mothers who brought their children to enjoy the higher-priced kids' meals felt that McDonald's was too dirty, too chaotic, and the wait was too long, with the taste deteriorating. As a result, it lost a lot of its customers. It's not the price drop itself, but rather that your operational strategy and execution level couldn't keep up with your pricing strategy, right? Yes, exactly, so its capabilities didn't fully match. Besides that, there was another issue. I don't know if everyone remembers, but back then McDonald's faced many food safety problems, including issues with the supply chain of McNuggets. At that time, McNuggets were actually taken off the shelves.
And then there were incidents of finding foreign objects in the burger meat. These issues further amplified consumer doubts about McDonald's trustworthiness. Oh, this might have been the last straw, because in fact, food safety is the lifeline for food companies. I've witnessed several times over the past decade how even a minor food safety incident can destroy a company because the brand's value is the most crucial. The fundamental guarantee is that your products are safe, clean, and hygienic, and only then can we talk about whether they taste good or what flavors they have. Sausage for Kadelan. I completely agree with the point you mentioned, which is that I believe in the food and beverage industry.
I feel that the food and beverage industry is like a marathon, because it is very tough and exhausting. You have to deal with service supply chains, retail, and price control. The entire chain requires attention to many aspects of it, and it's like running a marathon continuously. But the issue of food safety is somewhat like tripping while running a marathon. Sometimes when you fall, you might not be able to get back up. As you mentioned, many overseas companies, including many Japanese companies, have experienced decline, and food safety has often been a crucial turning point, a detail that acts as a trigger. Yes, a trigger.
I remember back in 2014, there was an incident in Taiwan involving Weichuan. Actually, it wasn't the Weichuan brand itself, but its parent company. The Wei family had an incident involving cooking oil, which caused quite a stir in Taiwan. It felt like the entire Wei family was about to be driven out of Taiwan. In fact, it had little to do with the Weichuan brand. Even a minor food safety incident can be catastrophic for a food company. I'm wondering if this relates to what you just mentioned. They attract more customers with low prices, but the entire supply chain and store management capabilities can't keep up. This includes whether the company is becoming more like a professional manager-driven organization, focusing on KPIs and so on. It seems to me that the issue is not with the strategy itself, but with the execution of the strategy, where critical links have completely failed. The result, as you mentioned, is very true. Food safety is just one point where problems are exposed.
The emergence of this food safety issue indicates that there are definitely problems with the company's management capabilities. In the case of McDonald's, they changed their CEO. The new CEO is actually Japanese, but he is very Western-oriented, as he has always worked in foreign companies, so he is more focused on improving the stock price during his short-term tenure to make the financial statements look better. So how did he make McDonald's financials look better? When he came to Japan, McDonald's was actually guided by him.
After he let go, everything turned into franchises, significantly increasing the franchise ratio. This way, there were fewer assets and fewer staff at headquarters, turning it into a franchise business, but this led to a loss of control over management. So, this is actually the real driving factor behind it. To improve, for example, the return on assets, They switched from direct operations to franchises, but their management capabilities didn't keep up, which caused problems. So have they come back in the last 10 years? This company is now ranked second in Japan, which is McDonald's Japan, and its performance is quite good. Okay, I think these two examples we've discussed so far are quite interesting. We have seen the possible phenomena, but the underlying reasons might be somewhat different, right? A price war might just be a phenomenon, but the key is whether you have the ability to handle a price war, including whether you can serve the customers gained from the price war well, and whether your entire supply chain and store operations can keep up. If done well, this is your successful strategy to capture market share, but if not done well, it can push you into the abyss. This is actually quite enlightening for some of the cases happening today, because I noticed that recently there have been some issues with milk tea, right? Many well-known milk tea brands have had some problems in random inspections. These things may seem very small, but every time, food safety issues start from tiny, seemingly insignificant matters and eventually escalate to the point where they can destroy the entire brand's value. There are countless such cases. Therefore, I believe that in a company's structure, the food safety inspection department should report directly to the CEO.
It should not be placed under the responsibility of other product managers. The CEO should manage it directly. This is something that, as a catering company, they must do. However, I think this raises an issue, which is,
can safety be managed well if I use a franchise system? Because in China, most of the so-called universal chains are actually all franchise systems, right? And with a franchise system, you inevitably don't have such strong control. So looking at cases like those in Japan, can a franchise system manage food safety well?
So McDonald's had issues, of course, because it transitioned from being well known to a franchise, as mentioned in the previous case. So are there any successful large-scale franchise system cases in Japan? It's a very curious point because most of the leading companies in Japan's food industry are actually directly operated chains, and the proportion of franchises is very small. Have you discussed why this is? Recently in China, the partnership model has become popular, which actually uses equity distribution to motivate employees to take on more responsibility. This is a change in some of China's models. I wonder if the underlying reason for this difference is that Japanese people are naturally good at management. It's a bit more difficult. The Japanese public may naturally have less desire to earn money from working compared to China because the wealth gap is relatively smaller. Therefore, many part-time workers in these companies are not incapable of working full-time, they just don't want to. They want to do something else for themselves and use their remaining time to work. So even if they are earning a steady wage, their service mentality might be closer to that of a full-time employee. So the cost of managing people is relatively low. Therefore, for them, they don't need to use a franchise model to motivate franchisees to leverage. Instead of relying on the perception of management ability, they use their own capabilities to directly manage the end stores. That's one aspect. Another is that the interest rates might simply be lower. So from a financial perspective, they don't need to use franchisees' money to open stores. In the early stages, when you have cash flow, in Japan's low interest rate environment, banks are eager to lend you money, offering you interest rates of 1% and a bit, not even reaching 2%, to open stores. Moreover, multiple banks come to you at once. This allows companies with cash flow in the early stages to expand quickly without using the leverage of franchising. This might be a combination of factors. I think this is a very interesting issue. I might share my own feelings, which is that I completely agree with what you just mentioned.
The issue of interest rates, the cost of capital, is actually a significant structural difference, right? This leads to the possibility that Japanese companies, for large companies, I operate directly and I don't need to rely on the financial leverage of franchisees. But indeed, another major difference, I think, is the professional quality of the employees, right? Because when we look at franchising in China, the main goal is to solve two problems. First, I use your capital. Second, I use your sense of ownership. And because running a store involves a lot of detailed tasks, and whether the store makes a profit or not ultimately depends on these details to generate profit. So it leverages everyone's sense of ownership to share the profits, right? In this regard, the difference between working for someone else and running my own store in Japan might not be very significant. Conversely, if I were to truly run my own store, they might pursue culinary excellence or with a lot of personalized expression and individuality because of the strong artisan spirit in Japan, right? So cooking is a very artisan-like endeavor, and if people really choose to run their own store, it might not necessarily be a franchise, but rather something that reflects their own taste. And there are actually a lot of such stores in Japan, where the dining scene is dominated by both major restaurant chains and individual standalone restaurants.
It's a market with a very severe bifurcation. Speaking from personal experience, in Japan, both middle schools and high schools have clubs. And I believe these clubs actually cultivate the Japanese people's ability to operate in a standardized manner. This awareness, let's say, how clubs operate. In Japan, clubs are very important. When you're in school, after classes, boys might join sports clubs, and girls can also join sports clubs or many cultural clubs. In these clubs, the hierarchy is very clear. Someone who is a year ahead of you is considered superior. And these clubs have their own operational standards with a strong emphasis on student autonomy. Typically, club teachers might not even show up, and students manage their activities independently, rehearsing, identifying issues, and solving them on their own. This is a form of organizational culture training. Therefore, this kind of training in organizational culture likely has a significant impact on the talent management costs in Japanese companies because from a young age, their education emphasizes self-discipline in operational matters.
Even if it's just persistence, having the awareness to carry out good operations reflects underlying aspects of nationality and culture in any consumer phenomenon. I'm actually curious about another dimension, which is about growth, because in the food and beverage industry, besides surviving through low-price competition in the existing market, everyone actually wants to solve the problem of growth in niche markets. I think these two issues are probably the most pressing concerns for Chinese food and beverage companies right now.
Are there any cases of significant growth over the past 30 years, or are there any cases of failure where efforts ultimately didn't succeed? Two cases, the first one we just mentioned, the 17 stores, I think they have still created many cases because they are number one. However, the revenue of these 17 stores does not rely solely on this one brand. It is multi-branded. Therefore, the first phenomenon that appeared in Japan is mergers and acquisitions. Because the cash flow in the restaurant industry is good enough, banks have a lot of money on hand that they can't lend out. Therefore, companies began to use leverage to borrow and seize such opportunities for mergers and acquisitions. However, a company like this grows through continuous mergers and acquisitions, and in a certain sense, the existing market is an integrated market, where the ability to leverage profitability and cash flow for mergers and acquisitions and integration is actually a very important capability for continuous growth among existing players. This is indeed a core factor in understanding holistic growth. Growth through mergers and acquisitions is also easy to deduce. It's about the ability to integrate the supply chain and improve operational leverage. Management efficiency is important, but beyond that, there's also innovation. This dimension is about how I can create new demand within an existing market. In this field, the best performer is actually called latecomer's advantage. Currently, it has an income of over 10 billion RMB. The group itself has about 1,800 stores, among which latecomer's advantage accounts for around 1,000 stores specializing in udon noodles, right? Because udon noodles are actually a major category in Japan. But in the main components, there has never been a chain. To solve this chain issue, many players have addressed it through the supply chain method, which means I deliver frozen dough to the stores. The store uses hot water to cook it, or some fresh ones. The dough is simply heated at the store using heat to complete it. However, this method, due to its overly simple supply chain, falls into a vicious cycle of not having a chain, with no player taking the initiative to create a chain. It's a bit like Chinese breakfast shops, right? Things like buns and steamed bread, or somewhat like the previous Lanzhou beef noodles or Lanzhou pooled noodles. Yes, so what Marugame Seimen actually achieved is the opposite approach, which is how to limit this sense of value. Put it in front of the users. Marugame Seimen achieves this through a realistic sense of value and very low prices in Japan. In the past 20 years, it has gained a very rapid barrier. Let me first talk about the price. A set meal costs about 20 to 30 RMB, Senarihui, which is low price, cheap, and very affordable. Let me describe the entire process to you. This company has a significant feature. Its process is very fast. A user can finish eating and leave the store in about 10 minutes. This high turnover rate allows them to attract more customers during lunchtime. Their peak capacity is very high. Typically, when a customer arrives at the store, they tell the noodle chef what kind of noodles they want. After receiving the noodles, the customer then serves themselves the soup. They can make their own side dishes, and the entire process takes about a minute. Okay, so this increases the standardization of the entire table setup, and it involves more participation from the customer. The customer participates, but the user also feels that because the noodle chef is right in front of them, transforming flour into dough, fermenting it, then cutting, and cooking it into udon noodles. So the user feels, oh, I'm eating something exclusive with someone making noodles right in front of me, which makes the experience very well understood and appreciated. So later on, during their growth process, did they encounter any resistance or obstacles? This kind of growing pains is something many companies experience when facing regulatory constraints. It's when their growth hits a bottleneck that companies start to wonder how they should pay more attention. The turning point was when they collaborated with others to launch a new product and discovered that, wow, many people would come when a new product was released. So they kept launching new products, but constantly releasing new products greatly damaged their highly efficient operations. Originally, something that could be served in 1 minute turned into a 5-minute wait, and one person couldn't check out, leaving a line of customers waiting. Eventually, people felt that the taste seemed to decline. The service time slowed down, and the prices increased because of the new collaborative products. Gradually, their performance was indeed challenged. Okay, so this seems to relate to their core, competitiveness and differentiation. You can't abandon the resulting losses for short-term growth. Short-term benefits are always very tempting, especially when growth hits a bottleneck, and perhaps everyone will use this Sitom method. Initially, you might taste some sweetness, but indeed,
it severely damages one's competitiveness. I feel that this case actually has two sides. From a positive perspective, we actually have many similar category tracks like this, where the category lacks a brand, and these are all large tracks because people are very accustomed to consuming them. At this point, how do you create some differentiation in the user experience? At the same time, if the supply can be sufficiently standardized, you can always make some micro innovations on these 2 points. This can give users a refreshing experience, and you can also achieve a very high level of scalability. These two aspects are actually quite weak, so how can you continuously maintain or strengthen them rather than letting, for example, scale growth distract you? This seems to always be a relatively important issue.
Yes, I think for those without a major brand, but within a category that has a large track, whether your brand's mindset and characteristics can be like a nail driven into the user's mind is very important. It's not that just because I initially succeeded with this model and made some micro innovations leading to growth, I should stop maintaining and making further efforts. Therefore, it actually goes back to the case of regulatory aspects we just discussed, where it reassesses its own capabilities through such a process. What is it? What should its positioning be? At this point, it returned to its core focus, aiming to make the best tasting udon noodles while offering a lower price. From then on, it actually enhanced the training of its artisan chefs and found ways to provide positive feedback to these chefs. For instance, at the entrance of each store, they might display the name of the udon noodle chef so that customers know who is making the noodles today, or they might offer salary bonuses based on different ratings, using these methods to enhance the quality of output in this category, which is challenging to standardize.
In the end, it still improved customer satisfaction. I actually feel quite deeply about this, as it relates to a previous episode where we discussed that no one can truly create a brand and everyone can only create products, and then you continuously focus on the core feature of your product, or as we call it, brand, your positioning brand, your label, repeatedly and consistently presenting stable quality to your users, allowing them to continuously deepen their memory of this aspect. This is how a brand is gradually built or cultivated, aligning with its intended image and perception. For categories like fast food, indeed, it's all about performance, results.
Only then can it be considered a brand, and a brand may not necessarily bring results. This might be the kind of relationship involved. From the Japanese perspective, I'll add a few more words. Japanese companies might achieve the result of becoming a category term, as just mentioned. For example, mechanical equals beef bowl, ramen equals domen, or sushi equals conveyor belt sushi, and so on. But I think his research on brands is not as good as that of the United States. The reason is that the real brand is the meaning of the brand itself that transcends the category. Once we asked in the fund, what would happen if a brand disappeared in the world? At that time, many of our colleagues answered McDonald's. In other words, what McDonald's carries is not just burgers, manpachi, but people's happy memories. Yes, when thinking about brands from this dimension, where the brand name equals the category word, I believe Japanese companies still have a long way to go. I understand. Your question just now and what actually came to my mind was Coca-Cola.
I think it's a similar concept. Actually, when we studied Coca-Cola before, we found that the company's supply chain and sales capabilities are extremely strong, rather than just the brand power that people imagine. But its brand has indeed stood the test of time. Going back, I actually quite agree with what you said, which is to say, many Japanese food and beverage companies might focus on creating product uniqueness on the supply side, turning the uniqueness of the product into part of our brand's mindset. What is something they do quite well, including what you just mentioned about collectivism or the understanding of standardization. Therefore, even if it's just because they can consistently provide consumers with products of stable quality, they are doing a pretty good job. However, on the consumer side, they might not be as prominent or as successful in commercializing aspects like brand spirit or emotional value as American companies.
My feeling is, yes, I think this is an issue of craftsmanship spirit. Because craftsmanship spirit comes from doing the job well, and you will definitely appreciate it. Yes, there's a bit of disdain for doing the latter part, right? It's not about how I make something you like.
Yes, I think this is a very interesting discovery, because it seems that from this perspective, the United States should be the market that balances these two aspects the best, or is the most mature in terms of branding. Many European brands may originate from Chuo, either royalty, passed down from their ancestors, or are similar to Japan in that they are based on manufacturing supply, like the high-quality products from Germany, right? I manufacture exceptionally well, they're durable and long-lasting, and people just love them. Japan might actually be of this type as well. Of course, France has its set of luxury goods, but aside from that, there might not be enough successful cases of how to tap into the ideal things in the minds of consumers. I think that's true.
To add a bit more, Japan's situation is influenced by natural disasters. For instance, when you look into the history of some Japanese companies, they often highlight natural disasters as a key theme or something they want to express. It's like, despite facing natural disasters, whether it's earthquakes, tsunamis, or typhoons, we have recovered. Or, despite how severe the natural earthquakes in Japan are, do you know how much damage this area has suffered? My company is still ensuring supply, convenience store companies would say this, so Japan might be more focused on a baseline logic when considering issues, because the entire society is in a country where disasters are relatively frequent.
I understand this is a very insightful observation, that it focuses more on maintaining the baseline. It's more about ensuring that even in the worst situations, Yikash, I can still maintain my supply. I can provide these things to you without pursuing the upper limit, like how much joy I can bring you, or emotional connections, and so on. This is completely off topic, but I'm thinking it might also be because the end of the bubble economy came too early. If the bubble economy had lasted another 10 years in Japan, perhaps emotional connections would have become more important. From this perspective, I think China seems to be in quite a mixed state. I understand that our baseline thinking is definitely not as strong as Japan's, probably because we are a large country with vast hinterlands. To put it simply, in rural areas, there's always a piece of land, right? At worst, you can go back home and farm. This kind of mindset is deeply rooted in people's hearts. So perhaps our baseline thinking isn't as intense as Japan's, but regarding the changes in social structure over the past few decades following the reform and opening up, people have been pursuing ideals, spiritual values, or to put it more plainly, hedonism, and extreme personal expression. It should be much more intense than in Japan, and I think it might be closer to the situation in Europe and America. Therefore, China actually has a better chance of creating those brands that we might call crossing the cycle, or those that can establish more positions on the demand side and in the minds of users. I believe this opportunity is quite significant.
I think this opportunity might not come from the first 30 years, but rather from the next 30 years of the stock market where such opportunities will arise. Or for entrepreneurs moving forward, they no longer have the same business model advantages as before. When there are no longer so many supply chain advantages, they might focus more on how to address user pain points within a limited market. From day one, they start thinking from the user's perspective. So how should I put it? Companies with a user perspective are often the ones thriving in this era of stock market.
However, I completely agree. I think that the growth over the past 20 to 30 years mostly came from the logic of large-scale penetration. Why? Our population was so vast and the market so expansive that as long as I could penetrate and reach, I could bring about scale and growth. Recently, we've started to see more investment in the supply chain, more barriers which can bring about extreme cost effectiveness. We ourselves, including this program, have talked a lot about this, and other brands have noticed it too. Another category is those that can truly cultivate and position themselves in the long term in the minds of users, becoming a brand that grows in the hearts of users. I think these elements can be seen in different brands, and they should have a better chance of becoming a more solid product and brand. Yes. I'm actually a bit surprised. I didn't expect that because the food and beverage industry is quite a long chain and a very industrialized field and track. We would eventually talk about the differences in brand positioning between China and Japan. Yes, from discussing food and beverage, we've now moved to the differences between countries. I actually think this is the root of many issues. Ultimately, a brand should be about people, not just consumers, but a certain aspect of people. The expression of emotions and culture. So it is always a commercial presentation that is closely related to the current era, emotions, and your culture. Yes. All right, well, why don't we wrap up our conversation here for today? Okay. Thank you very much. All right, let's find another interesting topic to discuss next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.